My father, Arthur, was shouting so loudly that the veins in his neck looked ready to burst, his face turning a terrifying shade of deep crimson. He pointed a trembling, angry finger at me from across the crowded courtroom, trying to convince everyone that I was a failure. "Look at her, Your Honor," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the walls. "She is completely unstable. A jobless wanderer who lives in a tiny apartment and cannot even speak for herself." He was demanding full control over my life, claiming I would throw away my inheritance on whatever reckless things unstable people buy. I sat there in absolute silence, my hands folded calmly in my lap, checking the time on my watch. It was exactly 10:02 in the morning, meaning everything was running right on schedule. Judge Vance stared down at him over her glasses with an unreadable, cold expression that made the room feel instantly colder. She leaned forward slightly and asked a single, chilling question that made the air freeze. "You really have no idea who she is, do you?" At the next table, my father's high-priced attorney, Julian, froze mid-motion, his eyes completely locked on a document the bailiff had just handed him. The color drained from his face so fast I honestly thought he might faint right there on the rug. Before the judge revealed the truth that turned my father's face ghost white, I knew this moment would change our lives forever. The silence in that mahogany-paneled room was heavy and pressurized, vibrating with the kind of tension that comes right before a massive dam finally breaks. I did not look at Arthur, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing a single tear or a tremble in my lip. Instead, I watched the dust motes dancing in a shaft of sunlight hitting the defense table, letting my mind drift back to Christmas Eve just 4 months ago. We were sitting at the long dining table in his grand estate, the exact house I was secretly paying the mortgage on to keep him afloat. Arthur had laughed, a cruel mocking sound, when I handed him my brand new business card. He tossed it onto the expensive white tablecloth like it was nothing more than a used napkin. "A consultant?" he sneered, swirling his expensive aged scotch while looking down his nose at me. "Is that what we are calling unemployed people these days, Nora? It is a cute little hobby, sweetheart, but let us be real, you are just playing pretend." I remembered the heat rising in my cheeks that night, the familiar, painful sting of being treated as the ultimate family disappointment and the invisible daughter. But sitting here in court, that bitter memory did not hurt me anymore. It felt like pure fuel because, while he was mocking my small hobby between bites of roast beef, he had absolutely no idea what I had actually accomplished. My supposed hobby had just secured a $15 million federal contract to audit a corrupt corporate supply chain. He saw a broke drifter, but I was actually the chief executive of Apex Global, a forensic accounting firm specializing in hunting down money that people wanted to hide. Right now, the specific money I was hunting happened to be his, and he was completely blind to the danger. "She is completely catatonic," Arthur shouted, pulling my attention right back to the loud courtroom. "Look at her. She has not uttered a single word today. So she is obviously heavily medicated or experiencing some kind of mental episode." He demanded immediate control over my life and finances, while I simply adjusted my silver cuff, feeling the cool metal against my skin. Let him scream and let him paint me as a fragile, broken little girl who could not keep a steady address. It was all part of my plan because if I defended myself now, I would just look like a rebellious child fighting her parent. My absolute silence made him look completely unhinged to the court, letting him dig his own grave so deep he would never climb out. He attacked my living situation next, claiming I lived in some run-down, broken rental property downtown. He told the judge I refused to let any family visit because I was deeply ashamed of my squalor. I suppressed a smile because he was talking about the Grandview building, and he was only right about one thing. I never allowed him to visit me there, but he was completely wrong about everything else. I did not live in a run-down rental apartment. I lived in the massive penthouse suite at the very top. More importantly, I did not just rent a space there. I actually owned the entire luxury building. In fact, I owned the commercial building where he rented his law offices, and he had no idea his landlord was me. Julian, his lawyer, was sweating profusely now, frantically tapping on his tablet and scrolling through the financial document the bailiff had provided. I knew exactly what he was reading, and it was a detailed summary of massive assets that did not belong to my ancestors. They belonged entirely to me, meaning I was not in this courtroom to fight over a family inheritance. I did not need a single penny of my grandmother's money because I made more in 3 months than my father made in his career. I was here because he had tried to weaponize the legal system to take away my personal freedom and erase my existence. Now he was about to find out that the daughter he bullied for years was actually the shark swimming in his pool. I looked up, meeting Judge Vance's steady eyes as she gave me a very small, knowing nod. It was finally time to spring the trap he had walked right into. The judge slowly flipped through the pages of the financial dossier, the rhythmic sound of paper cutting through my father's heavy, uneven breathing. Arthur was still posturing proudly, adjusting his silk tie and looking at the gallery as if he were a gladiator who had just won a major battle. He did not realize the entity that held his fate was sitting 5 feet away from him, wearing a dark blazer and a look of absolute boredom. I closed my eyes for a second to remember exactly why I had to take things this far. 2 years ago, my father's prestigious firm was quietly bleeding money, which I knew because I had easily accessed his accounts. His security password was literally his own name followed by the number 1 because he truly believed he was the center of the universe. He was 3 months behind on paying his staff and drowning in high-interest loans, desperately needing a financial lifeline. A normal parent would have asked for help, but Arthur decided to try and have me involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility instead. 2 police officers had shown up at my apartment door with an emergency hold order based on a forged statement from his golf club friend. He wanted to lock me away for 3 days just to file a motion to seize my personal trust fund. The officers left after 5 minutes once they saw my spotless home, my calm demeanor, and the federal badges of the agents on my computer screen. I did not press charges back then because that would have been too quick and far too merciful for what he did. Instead, I decided to become the architect of his worst nightmare by creating Apex Global as a quiet holding company based in Delaware. Through Apex, I approached his bank and offered to buy out every single piece of his toxic, failing debt. The bank was absolutely thrilled to offload such a terrible client, allowing me to purchase his loans and lines of credit. I then injected $650,000 into his firm under the guise of an angel investor. Arthur never asked questions or vetted the company. He just saw the massive funds land in his account and assumed the world recognized his genius. Instead of paying his struggling staff or updating his ancient legal software, he immediately went out and bought a vintage luxury sports car. I remembered watching him pull up to Thanksgiving dinner in that shiny car, revving the engine and boasting about his record-breaking financial quarter. He sat at the head of the table, looking right at me while claiming I was a financial burden on the family legacy. "It is embarrassing needing handouts at your age," he had said, while I just smiled and calmly ate my dinner. He thought he was the king of the castle, but he never actually checked the deed to his kingdom. "Your Honor," Arthur's loud voice suddenly snapped me back to the reality of the courtroom. He was leaning heavily on the podium, regaining his false confidence while claiming I had no grasp on reality or personal income. He asserted that my silence was just a defense mechanism because I knew I was absolutely nothing without his financial support. I looked at him and realized he was not a monster, but simply a very bad investment that I was closing out today. Julian finally looked up from the pages, his hands shaking so violently that the papers rattled loudly against the defense table. He leaned over to whisper something urgent, but Arthur angrily swatted him away like a common fly. "You might want to listen to your attorney, Mr. Caldwell," Judge Vance said, her voice sounding like absolute ice. She held up a single sheet of paper containing the ownership structure of Apex Global. "According to these official documents, the plaintiff in this room is not just your daughter. She is actually your direct boss." My father did not gasp or stutter. He just let out a wet, ugly laugh that stripped away his remaining dignity. He shook his head with condescending pity, claiming I could barely run a toaster, let alone a major corporation. Julian made a sound like a dying animal, grabbing my father's sleeve with white knuckles and telling him to stop immediately. "Look at the federal seal," Julian hissed, his voice trembling so hard it was audible multiple rows back. Arthur ripped his arm away angrily, refusing to sit down while claiming I was making a mockery of the court system. He pointed at my clothes, asking the judge if a person in scuffed shoes looked like a real chief executive. I glanced down at my footwear, knowing they were scuffed from climbing through a client warehouse window to verify missing inventory last week. I did not care about my shoes because, unlike him, I did not need to wear my net worth on my feet. He shouted that I lived in a crumbling brick pile downtown, believing he was delivering a fatal blow to my case. He told the judge I could not even afford a doorman, completely unaware that I owned the building. Judge Vance slowly took off her reading glasses, looking incredibly bored, which was so much worse than anger. Mr. Caldwell, I'm going to give you 10 seconds to sit down and shut your mouth, she warned calmly. If you say one more word about her mental state, I will hold you in contempt so fast your head will spin. Julian physically yanked my father down into his chair before he could argue further. The judge picked up the next document, stating that according to the property deed, I did not just rent a small space there. She slid the paper across the polished wood table until it stopped mere inches from my father's trembling hand. Miss Caldwell owns the entire building, including the commercial suites your law firm currently occupies, the judge stated flatly. Arthur blinked in utter confusion, his brain completely misfiring as he claimed he paid rent to a corporate entity called Apex Real Estate. The judge pulled out a thick binder, noting that Apex was the only reason his firm was still solvent after receiving massive funding. Arthur tried to save face, bragging that the investment company believed in his legal acumen, unlike his own daughter. I watched him boast, realizing it was almost tragic how he was celebrating the exact rope I had given him to hang himself. That is fascinating, Judge Vance echoed, turning the binder around so he could see the front page. The sole incorporator, chief executive, and primary signatory for Apex Global is Nora Caldwell. The air completely left the room as Arthur stared at my signature, the exact same one he had thrown in the trash on birthday cards. No, he whispered loudly, claiming this was a trick and that non-lawyers could not hold equity in a legal practice. He laughed manically, pointing a shaking finger at me and claiming I had just admitted to a massive regulatory violation. I did not flinch, but simply leaned forward and spoke to him for the very first time all morning. You are entirely right, Arthur, I said softly as I stood up and walked around the table. I did not buy equity in your failing law firm because I know the regulations perfectly. I stopped right in front of him, close enough to smell the stale scotch on his breath. I did not invest in your business, I bought your personal debt, I said clearly, tossing the heavy loan agreements onto his table. 2 years ago, you were payroll insolvent and about to lose your license for misusing client funds to pay country club dues. Apex bought your entire credit line, and then we extended you funds on a senior secured basis, meaning I own the collateral. Paragraph 12 states that insulting your guarantor in a recorded hearing triggers immediate loan acceleration. You called me incompetent on the record, which means you have defaulted, and the entire loan is due right now. Arthur's face drained of color as he whispered that he did not have that kind of money. I know you only have 12 grand left, so I am officially calling the loan and requesting an asset seizure, I told the judge. Arthur frantically grabbed his phone, shouting that he was filing for bankruptcy protection right now to stop me. Bankruptcy protects companies, Arthur, but it does not protect personal guarantors, I said quietly, presenting the final document. You signed a personal guarantee stating that if the business goes under, the entire debt transfers directly to your personal estate. You did not just bankrupt your law firm today, you completely bankrupt yourself. I now have full legal claims on your house, your vacation cottage, your luxury car, and your entire pension. Judge Vance brought her gavel down with a loud bang, dismissing the case with prejudice and granting the asset seizure. Mr. Caldwell, you have exactly 24 hours to vacate your personal residence, and the commercial eviction from my building is effective immediately. Julian packed his bags and fled the room without saying a single word to his client. Arthur sat there completely frozen, looking incredibly small, stunned, and entirely broken by the daughter he had tried to erase. I realized that true power does not come from loud shouting or expensive status symbols. It comes from quiet execution and holding the receipts.